Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's webinar, From Disparate Data to Tell-All Dashboards at Talkdesk, hosted by Data Informed and sponsored by Looker. My name is Steve Paul. I'm your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive between you and our presenters, and later in the program we'll ask for your feedback. You can participate in our Q&A session by asking questions about the information presented in this webinar at any time. Just type your question into the text box located at the bottom left of the console and then click the Submit Question button. We'll answer as many questions as time permits after the presentation. Slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and you can download a PDF copy of the presentation by clicking on the Download Slide link in the resource box on the bottom left of our console. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. And if you're experiencing any technical problems, please visit our webinar help guide by clicking on the Help icon on the bottom right of our console. If slides are not advancing, please press the F5 key on your keyboard to refresh your browser. And now on to the presentation, From Disparate Data to Tell-All Dashboards at Talkdesk. Discussing today's topic will be Ernest Wong, Product Manager with Talkdesk, Norris Haddad, Director of Tech Alliances with Looker, and Taylor Brown, co-founder of FiveTran. First, we'll hear from Norris.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'll just run through the agenda really quick to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about today. So we'll just go over the vision for the webinar briefly on how Looker and FiveTran see the world. We'll then very briefly dive into a very high overview of both FiveTran and Looker in a couple minutes, and then kick off the main start of the show, which is Ernest Wong with Talkdesk to talk about their experience, disseminating data at Talkdesk. So in terms of the vision for the webinar, so the ultimate, data dream and the end version that you want to end up with is a way to disseminate all of the information that's important at your organization to everyone that needs to use it, whether they're internal users or consumers of data, or external, like your customers, vendors, etc. We believe at Looker and FiveTran that in order to do that, you want to consolidate all of your data in one place so that it's really easily accessible for analysis. You want to transform that data, and we'll talk about a little bit about how, and join it across all the different data sources that you have, and then using an interactive and easy to use visual experience, disseminate that data through either reports or dashboards or interactive analyses to everyone that needs to use it. So with that, we'll just I'll kick it over to Taylor to give you a brief overview of FiveTran.
Awesome. Thanks, Norris. Hey, everyone. This is Taylor Brown, co-founder of FiveTran. And kind of as Norris was mentioning, what we do at FiveTran, and why I think I'll get into why this works pretty well with Looker is FiveTran is FiveTran is a data pipeline as a service. So what that means is we connect to our clients' cloud applications to their databases. We support some event collection libraries, and we can also bring in arbitrary files like CSVs, and we load them into our customers' data warehouse. We support Postgres, Redshift, Snowflake, and recently BigQuery to load this data in for our clients. So this is kind of the first step in organizing and centralizing your company data. To take like a little bit of a step back as to how FiveTran fits into this space and how Looker fits into the space and how the space has somewhat changed over the last few years, it's important to first kind of point out what the space kind of looked like, and this is what we call FiveTran, what we call the classic ETL. So this idea where, and this is kind of what a lot of companies did up to a few years ago, where you start by extracting the data, cleaning the data, transforming the data, aggregate and modeling the data, then loading the data into a data warehouse or database, and then visualizing the data. And the kind of key thing to look at in this paradigm is the aggregate and modeling step is happening prior to loading the data into the data warehouse. And the reason for this was First, that the cost of data storage is much higher, and so in order to conserve space and conserve money, companies would generally try and pre-aggregate this data. Secondly, the databases are generally transactional databases, so they weren't really built for doing this analytical type querying, and so in order to have performant queries, companies would pre-aggregate this data. Finally, the visualization layers, or the visualization layer is typically on the client itself, so you're shipping a lot of this data over to your laptop, in which case you'd want it to be as small as possible in order to work with it. The challenges with this are kind of akin to waterfall development, where you want to, or where you have to sit down and think through all the questions you want to ask of your data ahead of time, which is just very difficult to do and very unforgiving. And it also removes the business users and key stakeholders from the process. And so the big shift that we've seen is that the cost of data storage has gone down tremendously. There are really fantastic columnar data warehouses like Snowflake or Redshift or BigQuery on the market now that are built for doing this analytical type querying. And then finally, the visualization layers is also being cloud-based, has also revolutionized how this stack works. And so as we see it, and as we kind of call it more of a modern ELT, where we extract the data, clean it, transform it, load it in a more holistic way. Then companies do the aggregation and modeling step inside of the SQL layer, inside of the super fast data warehouse. And then you basically only ship the results to the browser. And as you can see, FiveTran basically handles steps 1 through 4 automatically for our clients, pulling data from their either events from their website or database from their various databases, or from their various cloud applications like Salesforce or Marketo or HubSpot, and then also just bringing in disparate CSVs and things like that. So we handle basically steps 1 through 4, and then 5 and 6 you can handle just in the SQL layer, and then using a number of different BI tools. And one of the things I think that really makes the combination of FiveTran and Looker very powerful is that if you had kind of a box around 5 and 6, this is essentially right where Looker sits. So it's a really great combination there. That I just wanted to give you guys a quick overview of that. I'm now just going to hand this over to Ernest to kind of dive in a little bit deeper about his experiences with this himself.
Thanks, Biller. We just have a few more slides on kind of continuing this story on the Looker side.
Oh, right. I forgot. Apologies about that. Norris,
no problem.
I'm going to hand it over to Norris.
No problem at all. So this next slide is basically just a continuation of Taylor's last slide. So if you, to take a step back, so Looker's architecture and the way we see, presentation and visualization, exploration of data is, as Taylor talked about, you want to centralize all of your raw data in a SQL store, Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, etc. So that's what we recommend in Looker. Load all of your raw data into that data store without any much aggregation or pre-processing ahead of time. In Looker, then you can create that business logic, create the necessary aggregations and joins using our semantic modeling layer. And typically, the data team or data analyst at the company will do that. And what that then allows you to do is, once you have all those metrics and dimensions and business logic in place, you can then open it up to business users via, click and drop interfaces and dashboards to explore that data in a really easy to use way, right? They already know that the dimensions they're using and the metrics that they're using are governed and standardized across the company. Everyone's using the same definitions of revenue or gross margin or lifetime value and et cetera. And they don't have to rely on, a central bottleneck or analyst to answer those questions for them. They can use those definitions and ask, any number of questions easily and iteratively. And that's how we believe that you build a data culture at a company. Just quickly on kind of the 3 technical differentiations of Looker that make that possible. Firstly, Looker's kind of unique in the business intelligence space in that it's 100% in database. And what we mean by that is Looker connects via live connection to the database and executes all the queries, against the database directly. We don't move any data from your underlying infrastructure into Looker's in-memory store. Looker doesn't have an in-memory store. It relies on the data warehouse that you've set up. So we don't store any data and we don't move any data, which our customers really value for both data security, but also the investment that they already made in the data warehouse is being utilized and not being kind of doubled effort. Secondly, Looker has, as I mentioned, the semantic modeling layer that lets you describe all of the granular data that you've loaded and present it to business users in a way that they'll know how to use. And then lastly, Looker's web architecture means there's no desktop client that you need to install. You interact with Looker as you would with the internet through a web browser or on any device. And because it's a fully web app, any reports are unique URLs. You can easily share them among other people at the company and disseminate any information that you're working with. So with that, I'd like to kick it over to Ernest at Talkdesk.
All right. Thank you, Norris. Hi, everyone. My name is Ernest Wong. I am the product manager for data products here at Talkdesk. I also lead our BI initiatives here as well. So first off, thank you to FiveTran and Looker for giving me the opportunity to get on my little soapbox today. And obviously, thanks to all of you in the audience who are tuning in. Without you, this would be a grand exercise in humility, so hopefully you find something useful in this talk. First off, a little bit about me, because you're probably wondering who is this guy and why should I listen to anything he has to say, which is a very fair question. So most of my background is in the enterprise IT space. I've done a number of things from large-scale systems integration to global deployment, custom development, IT strategy, so on and so on. But I think the one thing that has been consistent across my career thus far is that I like to think of myself as a capability builder, and that is going into an organization, whether it's a startup or whether it's like a Fortune 100 or whatever it is, and essentially building up a new capability that did not exist before. And that obviously has some components. There's obviously a technology component there, but there's also very much a people or a cultural component as well, and I'm very sensitive to both of those. And so when I went to Discuss, which was the first startup that I worked at, that was really what I set out to do, was to build up a new data capability at this company, and that's essentially what I did pretty much almost from scratch, and then came here to Talkdesk in hopes of repeating those successes. And so real quick about Talkdesk, because I'm probably sure that most of you don't know what Talkdesk is or maybe not have heard of it. We are a SaaS company. We are a real-time communication platform aimed at producing the most brilliant customer interactions possible. So what that kind of really means in non-marketing English is that we are a cloud call center, contact center solution. So essentially you can see from this diagram, we support a number of channels ranging from voice, SMS, video. We sit on top of carriers like Twilio, Plevo, among others. And what we do is essentially connect agents with customers. We integrate into call center operations. And the key thing that we do differently, or that rather that we do very well, is that we integrate with a ton of other applications. So Salesforce, Slack, Zendesk, Desk. I think we have at last count like over 50 integrations or something like that. And really we do all that to automate the customer service experience to make sure that agents have all the information that they need to deliver the best service possible, and also to make sure that customers get connected and get their issues resolved as soon as they can. So obviously, as a voice platform, as a communication platform, tons of rich data, which was one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to come here. Also an incredibly fast-growing company that is just increasing headcount hand over fist and selling like crazy. So great momentum, great forward momentum, and a great place to join as a initial data person, because they quite literally, and you'll see this in the following slides, have next to nothing in terms of a data competency or data capability. So great opportunity for me to kind of go greenfield. And the way that I like to phrase it is, instead of inheriting somebody else's mistakes, I get to make all of my own. So having joined the company, it'll be about a year now in November. This is kind of my mission, or this is how I always approach the problem of data, if you will, is that especially in this day and age, data is ubiquitous. Everybody talks about data. I hate the term big data, but sure, we'll throw it out there. But really the goal, in my opinion, is to turn data, which is inherently inert, and I illustrate that here by just being a series of ones and zeros. Ultimately, you want to turn that into value. And value, at the end of the day, can mean a number of things. But I think this is the distinction that I make when I talk about data products, is that products themselves, if you kind of put on a product manager hat or mindset for a moment, is all about solving a problem. It's about delivering a value prop to your end user, right? And so you can take data, you can make reports out of it, which is fine. That's pretty baseline, if you will. You can do some analytics on it and to do some insights, which again is great, but that kind of implies a more ad hoc type of thing that you're doing, like, oh, I'm doing a study or I'm doing a research project. But if you turn that into a product that has its own kind of product life cycle, that takes on iterations on its own, that really seeks to understand what the underlying problem the user is facing, and in this case maybe the user is your CEO or BizOps or what have you, then you really kind of see things through a different lens. And so this is my mission at Discuss, this is my mission here at Talkdesk, and hopefully this kind of illustrates the mindset that I approach this particular topic with. So, great, super pumped, came to new company, they got nothing, there's going to be tons of quick wins, it's going to be really easy to prove my value. So, all right, cool, where's my team? Well, that's about it. So when I first joined, I was pretty much a one-man team for a couple months. The company was still growing, and they kind of wanted me to get in first to help advise on how we should be building our data infrastructure up, as opposed to having data engineers already and then not knowing what to do with them. So, it was definitely a challenge in the beginning, but I think I highlight this because the lack of engineering resources is a key constraint that really dictated how the next few steps that I took. Because when you don't have a ton of engineers and you can't really, I'm not a one-man data ops shop. I'm not going to stay up all night making sure that things are running and that, nothing is going down. So you really need to think about, well, how am I going to create scale with virtually no headcount? And so, okay, fine. That's one thing I'm aware of. I'm not going to sit around and wait for engineers to get hired. So what do we do, right? As probably a byproduct of my consulting background, I start with, the current state. All right, so what's going on today? What do we have? So I started by taking an inventory of all of the different, I call them data sources or publishers, if you will, in Talkdesk. And you can see from this slide, we've got quite a few. And the main takeaway here is that it's very fragmented, right? So we've got, obviously, our application data runs or is in MongoDB. We've got a couple different instances there. Those of you in the audience who cringed a little bit when I said Mongo, that is the right reaction to have as an analyst, because it is not fun working with unstructured data. And then if you go look at our functional systems, obviously nothing too surprising here. You got Salesforce that's powering sales, success, and marketing. We have Zendesk as our support software. We've got Marketo in marketing, Zuora for our billing and finance. And it goes on and on. There's just lots of different things that we have here at different levels. And really what's happening today is all of this data is kind of, if you will, proprietary to these different systems. And if anybody ever wanted to do some kind of cross-functional type of analysis, like, what's the retention like on our customers who come in through different channels? So that would be a marriage of Salesforce and application data and maybe even some finance data. Doing that would have been incredibly manual, would have been incredibly prone to error, and would have just taken a lot of time that pretty much nobody had. So it just wasn't getting done at all. Great. So we're off to a good start. Okay, this is pretty much everything that I should be concerned about from a data sources standpoint. Let's look at what we have today in terms of what people are using. So again, like when I said literally nothing, I was not exaggerating. On the left, I've just kind of represented the 4 different buckets or categories of data sources that we have: our application data, our functional systems, our raw events, our third-party data sources. And really, we didn't have much of anything. You can see here we had Intercom, which people were using as kind of a stopgap reporting solution that was ingesting data from our application as well as from our raw events in RabbitMQ, our raw messaging events in RabbitMQ, but it was known to be unreliable. And so this is kind of the most amazing thing that I found when I started, was that everybody told me Intercom is unreliable, and yet everybody used it. And that was quite honestly because they didn't have anything better. And that is incredibly sad. But again, makes it kind of easy for somebody new like me to add a lot of value quickly when you realize that the standards or the expectations are so low. So where do we go from here? Well, the first thing I did was I need to tackle this Mongo problem, because that, if any of you have ever worked with Mongo or run Mongo queries, it's not good. When you're an analyst and you're trying to rely on the presence of data, the completeness of data, working in a structureless or schema-less database like Mongo is definitely not ideal. Not only because Mongo itself isn't really made for things like aggregation, like your typical relational, like SQL-based database would be, but doing joins, like doing anything remotely interesting from a data standpoint is just not really what Mongo is made for. And so my first order of business was, okay, let's just get this in a SQL-friendly format so that I can actually run queries in a way that I can understand and scale. So looked around quite a bit, and we're also, by the way, running on a pretty old version of Mongo, so all of the newer, fancier SQL conversion tools are not available to me or to us at that point in time. And so MoSQL ended up being the best solution for us, which, if you're not familiar with it, is basically some open source software that I think, you can definitely get it on GitHub if you just search for MoSQL. And it basically just converts or replicates your Mongo database into a destination, into Postgres specifically, which I'm a big personal fan of. Excuse me. And so that was really the first thing. And getting MoSQL up and running took a little bit of intervention from our ops team. But really, at the end of the day, it's incredibly simple. All you do is you basically create a YAML file that maps the keys in Mongo into basically a schema in Postgres. And it has really cool options that let you pull in other fields that you did not specify in your schema into what they basically have an extra props or extra properties column. So if your engineers decide to one day add something new, like some new key and they didn't tell you about it because, why would they tell you about it? You can that MoSQL automatically picks that up and dumps into Postgres, and it's all JSON encoded. So it makes everything really easy. You can also specify types in MoSQL, and it's pretty good at handling things that, like handling malformed rows or rows that don't fit a certain type. Anyway, so that was a big step forward for me, getting our application data into Postgres. And again, there are 4 different instances of Mongo there, each holding different types of data. And so that was really the first thing that allowed me to start doing something remotely useful. And at this point, maybe a bit premature, maybe not, but I already got Looker up and running, sitting on top of Postgres. I deployed Looker previously at Discuss, did a very thorough evaluation of different BI solutions there. I think I did over 8, and it took weeks, actually months at that point, and concluded there that Looker was far and away the best solution available to me at the time. And so when I came here to Talkdesk, it was, for me, a foregone conclusion, and I'll talk more about that in later slides. But what was really valuable here is that because Looker sits on top of any backend, it's pretty backend agnostic, right? It can be anything that's basically SQL compliant or JDBC or ODBC connected, it'll work. So without even having a fully fledged data warehouse, I was able to get Looker sitting on top of Postgres and already be able to provide value to my users. And I think that is a really key thing to hit on, because when you're just starting off in a new organization, you want to be able to provide some quick wins. And being able to basically expose the data that was buried or locked away in Mongo to end users was huge. And I know it sounds kind of trivial just to allow somebody to see what, like, maybe a given configuration is on an account, but cannot understate that that was a huge improvement over what we had before, because previously there wasn't really any way to do that. We'd have to go into our support dashboard, which is basically like a super admin, to look at those kinds of settings, and it's very dangerous, to say the least. So that was phase 0, and really this happened in pretty much a matter of weeks, like 2 or 3. And again, really, really amazed at how quickly that was able to happen. Again, MostSQL just EC2 box, a little bit of help from ops. Postgres, that's in Amazon RDS. Looker hosted, like pretty much nothing you need to do there except for create a user in Postgres and then have Looker authenticate. So what comes next? All right, so we got our phase 0 stuff done. We've got our application data getting converted from a horrible Mongo format or unstructured format into a SQL format. Now onto the next piece, which is really the key piece. How do we get all of this disparate data from Salesforce, Marketo, Zendesk, et cetera, into our data warehouse as well? And so this is where FiveTran really saved me. Is, before when I was at Discuss, the way that we would do this is I had a team of data engineers who would basically build applications that would hit all of these different endpoints, ingest the data, load it into a staging area like S3, and then from there load it to our warehouse or do some ETL on it. And I didn't have any of that, right? I don't have a team. I don't have the time, and I needed to do something quickly. So I started looking around. And actually, I came across FiveTran on a Looker forum, which I think is kind of hilarious. But I was looking for ways to get, specifically like Salesforce and Zendesk data into Redshift. And went looking around, and I think the question that was posted was something along the lines of, is there something like Looker for ETL? And I know it sounds like a funny question, but it's, mainly because Looker, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is really great for self-service. And people like me were looking for a way to easily get data from these different places into their warehouse. So that was a question. FiveTran came up on the list, along with a few others. I investigated and basically learned that this was a thing now. Like data integration or data pipeline as a service was a thing now. That wasn't a thing when I was at Discuss, and it really changed the way that I approached this infrastructure problem. And to me, I got really excited because it was a way that I could, again, scale up with next to no engineering resources, and again, provide a lot of immediate value to the organization. And so what you see here is essentially, this was what we basically needed in the very beginning. The ability to get all of our application data, the ability to get all of our functional data, like or function-specific data, into our data warehouse in one place, and then have Looker as the UI layer behind on top of all that. And so, excuse me. And what's kind of notable here is, if you remember from the previous slide, Looker was sitting on top of Postgres. Once we introduced Redshift into the equation and got it populated with our various data from our different functional systems, it was pretty much trivial to just change Looker to sit on top of Redshift instead. Really seamless migration there. And the last slide, which I won't cover in great detail, phase 2 is basically the other part of our data pipeline. So there's a much more real-time aspect here. We have our raw events, which we want to do stuff with. We have third-party APIs that we need to kind of custom build for. But that's really what we are continuing to work on today, which is a separate pipeline. But most of the conversation is really about the top half here, the phase 0 and phase 1 stuff. But this is just to give you a complete picture of how the rest of our stack looks. So with that, I can get into some of the details of why I made certain decisions. I'm sure some of you who have done this in the past already kind of know some of this stuff, but just to cover what motivated me. So first off, why Redshift? I think by now it should be fairly obvious, so I won't spend too much on this slide. But again, I think context is really important to keep in mind. So when you're just starting off like I was, no team, one person, need to show some quick wins, need to have some quick turnaround time, Redshift is just a great default answer because, again, being an AWS product, deployment and scaling is super simple, super easy. In the beginning, again, you don't really know how much load to expect. The data warehouse is new, so you don't have any idea of how your users are going to be, how aggressively your users are going to be pounding it. And so being able to scale up or down on a whim is a very key feature to have. Like, that flexibility is invaluable. Another key thing that was really, really critical in my selection of Redshift as the first data warehouse is its ecosystem. Redshift's been around for a while. There's a whole plethora of other companies that have kind of built their own businesses around it, FiveTran and Looker being great examples of those. And so I knew that if I went with Redshift, I'd be able to find other solutions that would be well integrated with it. And, that was really one of the key things that drove me from choosing something else like, say, Snowflake or another backend was I just knew that Redshift was going to have partners and be pretty easy to find them as a result of that. And, this was huge. It might not seem like a big deal, just getting data from one place to another, but you have to keep in mind that prior to us having an actual warehouse, all of our queries were run against our production backend, which is exactly as scary as it sounds. It has gone down before. We, had to take precautions like running large queries at odd hours of the night when everybody was asleep so that, the load wouldn't take down Mongo and silly things like that. And again, this is the first iteration. There's definitely other databases or data warehouses that we might consider in the future, but to start, Redshift is, again, a great default selection. And so why Looker? Why did I go with Looker? Like I mentioned before, did it, I discussed, loved it. I had Looker up and running for a little bit over a year at Discuss, and even when I remember this very distinctly because I was surprised, but even the week before I was about to leave to go to Talkdesk, I would still get people coming up to me saying, "Oh my God, Looker's amazing. Thank you so much for introducing that." And I don't know if you'll ever hear that kind of feedback for any other BI tool. But anyway, why? So we already kind of touched on it earlier, but it's for me, again, being a one-man team, it's all about scale. How do I scale myself technically? How do I scale myself personally? So big reason why I love Looker is it's very agnostic in a sense in that it's purely a front end. If you think about it, it's purely a front-end into your data warehouse. And what that means is it doesn't really matter how crazy your data gets or how intense your processing gets. It's just the front end. And so as long as you keep growing, as long as you keep adding more use cases or more reports or whatever, it's your back end that's doing all the heavy lifting, and that's really where all the heavy lifting should go. Like as a front end, it should be light, it should be easy to use, and it really shouldn't care, if you will, about what's happening behind the scenes. And again, kind of like what Nursery touched on earlier, all the processing, and also Taylor as well, all the processing is on the fly, whether it's on the fly or scheduled, stays in the data warehouse. So we used to have Tableau at Discuss before we switched over to Looker, and that was kind of a nightmare for us because we always had to deal with data extracts, which I basically considered a secondary ETL. And if you guys know, ETL is already itself hard enough. It's prone to a lot of risk and things breaking and going wrong. And what ended up happening was we got to the point where we had so many reports that needed to run on very specific data extracts that we had ETL, which started at about 2 a.m. Pacific time, and that would finish roughly at about 6 a.m. And then we would have the Tableau data extract process refresh starting at about 7 a.m. because you want to give a little bit of buffer just in case ETL finishes late. And then that would then take another 6 hours or more. And so you're almost and we had teams on the East Coast as well. So it was like halfway through their day already before they could get data for the previous day. And that was just not a good experience for anybody. Not to mention that if you had ever had issues in ETL, you have to rerun ETL for a certain table. You then also have to rerun the data extracts that depend on that table. And again, nobody's happy for that. So that's what I mean when I talk about technical scaling. On the personal front, Looker is great for not having for letting me not be a query monkey, because I'm sure everybody who's done this kind of work knows in the beginning you write some queries because you have to get a report out to somebody who really needs it, and they'll come back to you like in a week and say, oh, can you run that thing for me again, but for the most recent week, or can you run that thing for me again but with a slight change? And that's not really fun as an analyst, right? Like, you do it because you need to, but these types of things are really mundane, and all they do is take up time and bandwidth that you would probably rather be using for something else. With Looker, you model it once, you build a report, and then from there, you let people kind of fish for themselves, which for me was huge because that basically offloaded a huge amount of really boring work that I didn't want to do onto the end users themselves, and also kind of to what Nurse was speaking about earlier, really builds that data culture because it allows people to fend for themselves. Like if data is accessible, if data is something that they can easily see and touch and feel on a daily basis, it becomes less terrifying, it becomes less intimidating, and ultimately that comfort is what leads to really great adoption. And I can go on and on about Looker. You can probably tell by now I'm kind of a fanboy. But it's just a really great product. Everything from the product itself, the in-app chat support is a lifesaver. Their documentation is always up to date and comprehensive. They're always rolling out new things really quickly, and so really have had pretty much no complaints about Looker, both from myself as the analyst as well as from my end users as the consumers. So why FiveTran? Again, this was something that was pretty new for me when I was starting out at Talkdesk. These types of solutions did not exist when I was at Discuss, and really to me it blew my mind. It was like, this is game changing. This is like it's going to really change the way that I approach this problem, like I mentioned. So again, scale. Scale is like a recurring theme here. If you think about it from a cost standpoint, there's a little joke here, almost infinitely cheaper than paying the salaries of Silicon Valley data engineers. Not to mention, again, the cost of hardware, the cost of maintenance. What FiveTran does essentially is hooks up to all these different data sources, like Salesforce, like Marketo, like Talkdesk, et cetera, and pulls it in. And obviously it's hitting all their APIs to do that. And if you've ever managed these types of applications before, you know that kind of sucks. You know that these APIs are always going to change at some point. They're going to change their versions, which means that you need to allocate time for your engineers to read up on the new spec, update the application to adhere to their new standards. You have to do maintenance. You have to make sure the lights are always on. And not only is there a cost to that, but most data engineers that you meet probably don't really find a lot of joy in doing this kind of work. It's very much an operational role. There's not a whole lot of new or surprising challenges to it. It's just kind of a thing that needs to get done. And so, A, it's already bad enough to pay for these engineers. B, you're going to be paying them a lot of money to do something kind of boring that they don't really want to do to begin with. So that's scaling in terms of cost. Integration scope is huge. This was probably the biggest differentiator that FiveTran had over the other data integration as a service providers that I evaluated, is that they had all the integrations that we needed. And specifically, Zuora was the one that most other competitors did not have. And really the key point here is a good data integration or data pipeline as a service solution should have all the integrations that you need. It should have all the things, because if not, what's the point? Like if you get one that has all but one of the integrations that you want, then you still need a data engineering team to build an application against that API. You still need to do all that maintenance and all that other crap that I talked about above. And so the whole point is to not do that. And so you need a solution that's going to address all the different integrations that you need. And it's something I learned from Taylor when I was kind of digging into picking his brain about how they are able to do the things that they do. Is he mentioned that, up front they spent a lot of time designing a really good integrations framework so that when they have new ones to add, they can do so very quickly, which I think is key, because if you build each of these individually, it takes a lot of time, not going to go too well. But, really, and Taylor can probably speak more to this if anybody in the audience has questions, but they've added so many integrations since I've started using them that it's pretty impressive. I know recently I don't know if this is, I probably won't talk about it because I don't know if it's okay for me to mention the beta that we're in. Anyway, and the last thing is it's a low barrier to entry. So FiveTran assumes that I'm a total idiot, which would be very accurate. And the onboarding, like how to set up a new integration, is so easy that even a non-engineer like me can do it. And they have everything from like screenshots to like, here's the exact SQL code that you need to run to give us permissions on your warehouse. And if you're not as savvy with that kind of stuff, FiveTran makes it incredibly easy to get started. And I really appreciate that just from like a product standpoint, like that UX is very, very low friction, and again, makes it easy for just about anybody to get up and running. Even if you don't know what it is that you're doing or why, like what that query actually does, you don't really need to, because they've told you, just run this, just run it and it'll be fine. And for the most part, that's true. And the last thing, which I think is really an important factor to consider, is pricing. Not in terms of like the actual dollar amount, but how it's structured, because at least when I was evaluating these solutions, a lot of other data integration as a service providers were charging based on volume of rows replicated. And when you are talking with your head of engineering, trying to convince her that this is a solution you want, she's always going to want to know, well, how much is it going to cost, and can I budget for that? But trying to figure out how many rows I'm going to replicate from like 4 different instances of Mongo, and how many different functional systems like Salesforce and Zendesk and all that, I don't know. There's no real way for me to gauge or predict. I mean, there is a way, but probably not a good way, or I don't want to spend the time to do that. So the way that FiveTran structured their pricing is basically by tiers, which basically makes it really easy for me to tell her, hey, it's going to cost this much per month or per year, and you can always bank on it being this much. And that, again, makes it easy to push through the PO process from a finance standpoint. So those are all the reasons that I chose, the different solutions that I chose. If you guys have more questions, happy to get that later on. But just to wrap up, when I talk about, well, now that we did all this stuff, what were we able to do? So just some examples. There's a lot, but just to give you an idea. So here's a question that came up pretty often. Sales is trying to close a deal, shocking. And, part of what makes that possible is for them to find a list of comparables or other solutions or other customers that we have today that are similar to the one that they're trying to close. So what large customers do we have using the same set of integrations that they're interested in, operating in a specific region of the world? And you can see here that is a question that we are now able to answer, because we have large being defined as how much money they rake in from Zuora. We know what integrations they're using from Mongo, our application backend, and we know where they operate based on where the lead came from in Salesforce. And so now you're able to marry those 3 sources of data and answer this one question cohesively. Another example, support. When our customers are having call quality issues, we need to figure out why. And so what is the configuration? We have a lot of configurations of our customers who are tagged with a call quality issue, and what is the actual quality of the calls that they've made. And so obviously Mongo is where our configurations live. Zendesk is where our tickets live, and that's where the tags on tickets live. And then we also have our Twilio data, which again, all getting piped into our data warehouse in one place. And Looker makes it really easy to consolidate and analyze all that data together. And lastly, finance. They want to be able to segment our accounts based on the value they bring to our company. So what is our committed revenue? Again, that's in Zuora. And what is their annualized uncommitted revenue? Again, that's in Zuora. Based on the account age, that's in Salesforce, and their active status. So, these really complicated questions that touch on data that live in many different places have now suddenly become very possible to answer. Whereas before, like I mentioned, they would have taken a human. What they would have had to do is to go to each of these different systems, run whatever report or query they needed to run in that system, export that CSV, take that data, and either combine it into something like an Excel spreadsheet or load it into some kind of database, which nobody was doing at that point anyway, and then trying to, find the keys and map everything together, probably via a huge series of VLOOKUPs or something like that, which, again, if you can imagine that, does not sound like something fun. So we basically took all that away and replaced it with something that was incredibly easy to use, that was incredibly accessible to an end user, and most important to me, gave me free time to do the things that I think really matter, which is building up that data competency as opposed to just running the same queries over and over. And really, I think at the end of the day, what this whole infrastructure enables, and this is, again, a lot of this talk obviously is very infrastructure or, maybe technical in nature, but I do want to spend a moment to emphasize the culture aspect of building a data competency, because it's not just having, the right pieces of software or the right hardware behind the scenes. It's really about empowering your end users to feel like they can work with data and that they don't need to go through a gatekeeper like an analyst, or they don't need permission to do this kind of stuff. And so, I think that the collective intelligence of everybody in my organization is obviously going to be far superior than me or any team of analysts that I might have. And I'm never going to know sales as well as the sales guys actually do. I'm never going to know finance as well as our head of finance actually does. And so for me to say that, I can produce insights for your group better than you can is just extremely arrogant and untrue. And what this does is it allows people to get the insights, to produce the insights that they actually care about by empowering them with the data that they need to find them. So that is the end of my prepared content. I'll turn it back over to Steve now for any questions you guys might have. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
Okay, very nice job. Thank you very much. Excellent presentations. Before we go to our audience Q&A, though, we'd like to first ask the audience to please fill out a feedback form survey that is now appearing on your desktop. To complete this form, just press the Submit Answer button at the bottom of the page, and thanks in advance for filling out this form. Your participation in our survey will allow us to serve you better in the future. And now on to the question and answer portion of our event. As a reminder, to participate in the Q&A, just type your question into the text box located at the bottom of the console and then click the Submit Question button. And we already have a number of great questions, so let's get started here. First, for Ernest, how do you foresee these tools, Looker, FiveTran, Redshift, scaling and growing with Talkdesk and supporting your future needs?
Yeah, great question. So it's actually kind of timely because in each of those different tools, I can talk about that real quick. On the Redshift front, we have already increased, our cluster size dramatically based on the amount of data that we are ingesting, not only from FiveTran and the different sources that I mentioned earlier, but kind of that phase 2 portion of that infrastructure diagram that I showed earlier, like all the raw events that we're pulling in from Rabbit as well as other third parties. We've already basically topped off on our initial deployment of Redshift and had to scale up, which is great, right? Because, what that basically tells us is that people are finding the data useful, they're finding the warehouse useful, and they're basically asking for more things. On the FiveTran front, I might defer to Taylor real quick if I'm able to talk about the beta that I'm currently in. I don't know if he wants to make that public news yet. But
yeah, that's fine, Ernest. That's fine. You can go ahead and disclose it.
Okay, sure. So a Mongo integration is basically what FiveTran's been working on, and that's obviously huge news for me because that allows me to cut out that MoSQL and Postgres portion of the pipeline. And again, the thing that's really great about having a partner like FiveTran is most recently I've had one of the leaders in marketing come by and say, hey, we've got data in Google Analytics and I forget the other tool, but they had data in Google Analytics that they wanted to import into our warehouse and be able to access in Looker. And literally all I had to do is log into the FiveTran dashboard, see the integrations, and sure enough, Google GA is there. And I can immediately tell them, like, yeah, we can do that. That's literally all it takes. There's no going back to your engineering team, trying to do a spike or an assessment on how much work it's going to be to, get this new API endpoint up and running and yada, yada, yada. So it's just been incredibly easy and for me, very satisfying to be able to just, give straight answers to our end users like that. And on the Looker front, again, because it's pretty much just the front end, it doesn't really care how much is happening behind the scenes in terms of your back end. And so, you could have a table that has just exploded in size, but on the Looker front, it's still the same table. And all the things that you would do would basically be on the back end, like tuning, like maybe adding some keys or some indices. But on the Looker front, it doesn't care. And that's kind of the part that I like is it doesn't have to care.
Okay, great. We have a question here from Jeef. Which database vendors can Looker integrate with?
Thanks. That's a great question. I'll take this. So Looker integrates with any SQL backend, as we mentioned. So those can be, traditional kind of relational database technologies, thinking of Postgres, MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, etc., to any MPP or analytics data store like Redshift, Snowflake, BigQuery, Teradata, or Vertica, etc., to SQL Hadoop. So we also have customers connecting to Hadoop either on-premise or in the cloud via Spark SQL, Hive, Impala, etc. So what is common across all these is that Looker basically connects the database via JDBC. So any SQL backend we basically support. Where you have data sources that are not SQL, we typically work with partners like FiveTran to get them into a SQL format, and then you can access them all in Looker.
Okay, thank you. Ernest, question here from Jennifer. What have you done differently at Talkdesk over Disqus? What did you do wrong the first time? All feedback is very helpful.
Good question. I'll say I didn't do anything wrong. Is that fair? So on the serious side, I don't necessarily. Well, first off, what was very different, like I already touched on, was the fact that products like FiveTran existed this time around, and that really changed the way that again I approached the problem because it's like, well, I don't need a team of engineers to do API maintenance, development and maintenance anymore. I can definitely just, find a partner whose sole purpose is taking care of that. And, that was definitely the biggest thing. I can go into more detail about the implications of that, but that would easily be the biggest thing. Other things that were different, and I can get a little more detailed around this. I think the first time around with Looker is it takes a very strong platform approach to developing like reports and dashboards and producing insights and things like that. But I think the way that we went about using the product at Disqus was not ideal. And that tends to be not super uncommon. If it's your first time using something, you tend to overly rely on certain aspects of certain features that you're familiar with. You tend to over rely on. And I think the main thing that we did differently with how we've deployed Looker at Talkdesk is that I've learned a lot of lessons in terms of, and really, I'm kind of bouncing around, but it goes back to that diagram that Taylor showed earlier about the old ETL process and the new ELT process, or the data lake approach, for those of you familiar. Because what we had back at Disqus was still a lot of process aggregates. We still had a lot of, kind of ETL dependencies in that sense. But here at Talkdesk, really have kind of tried to embrace that data lake approach. There's minimal processing for the data that goes directly into Redshift. And so a lot of that more sophisticated modeling that was happening in ETL previously at Disqus has now been moved into the LookML layer in Looker. So more on the fly and much more extensible.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. We have time for one more question here. See if we can squeeze this in. Marshall wants to know, there are tools that can do what FiveTran and Looker do. Why would you pay for two tools over one that can do it all? Who'd like that?
I can take a stab at that. I guess that question reminds me of something that my dad used to say, and this is going to date me a little bit, but when there was a shift from VCRs to DVDs, there was this product that was being sold that was basically a combination TV, VCR, and DVD player all in one. And my dad refused to buy those things. He said, you don't want to buy something that is going to be mediocre at everything. You want to buy stuff that is really good at the one job that it has. Also because when it breaks, it'll be much easier to repair. And so whether or not he knew it, he was referring to a best-of-breed approach, but that was something that always kind of made sense to me, was that, there are definitely tools that integrate or that do all the jobs that FiveTran and Looker do together. But in my experience from the evaluations that I've done, they don't really excel in any of those any of those capabilities. Like Looker is very, very good at what it does. FiveTran's very, very good at what it does. And I think because they scope themselves and limit themselves to those specific jobs, that's why they become really, really good at what they do. If you're trying to do like many things, it's hard to focus. It's hard to really know, what's the most important thing. Unless you have like a huge team or you're a giant tech company, then maybe that's, a different story. But I like that they've focused on their specific job in the stack, if you will. And then another reason, which is really more practical, is, again, I think the way that this works, the way at least this data pipeline works, is it's very modular. Again, like Looker is pretty agnostic in terms of its backend. It doesn't really care if you're Redshift or Snowflake or whatever. It'll do its job great regardless of what you put behind it. So for me, it was like, it doesn't really matter. There's no real benefit that is realized, including the cost standpoint, by the way. There's no real benefit that's realized by having a more integrated solution versus having it split up like FiveTran and Looker.
Okay, well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this session. So if we didn't get to your question during the live broadcast, someone will be able to follow up with you over the next few business days. And we want to thank you all for attending today's webcast from Disparate Data to Tell All Dashboards at Talkdesk, hosted by Data Informed and sponsored by Looker. Shortly after this live event, we'll send you an email reminder so you can access this presentation on demand. On behalf of our guests, Ernest Wong, Product Manager at Talkdesk, Norris Haddad, Director of Tech Alliances with Looker, and Taylor Brown, Co-founder of FiveTran, we want to thank you for your time, and have a great day.